And I forgot, I can't believe I forgot the two most important things. Since we are smaller during the summertime, we're like about half of our normal size, we're going to try what I'm calling cuddling. And that means we're going to try using only the first 7 rows and squeezing together as much. I'm not going to make you do it now. I know it's a little awkward. Don't worry about it right now. Next week. And I'm calling it cuddling because sometimes it gets really cold in here. So you can consider you're doing your neighbor a good job, warm, getting body heat together and keeping them warm, okay? So we'll cuddle. Let's do that, okay? We'll start next week, or if you want to do it now, you can. And we have 2 birthdays, which is why we have special cupcakes afterwards. Sammy, this week, it has a birthday, and Hyoshik, who's sort of our eyes in the sky, has a birthday as well. So happy birthday to these 2 ladies, and we'll have special treats for you afterwards in the back. Okay, now to the heart of the matter. We've been going through this book of Acts. I'm trying to pace along now towards the end of the summer to wrap it up. That's why we're skipping some chapters. And fundamentally, what we've seen is, hopefully you've seen it too, is that every time this gospel message or Jesus or the kingdom of God gets preached, people start to change. They start to act differently. They start to spend their money differently. They start to spend their time differently. The gospel, before the church is instituted, the gospel changes people fundamentally and deep down in their hearts. But it not just changes on the inside, it changes them on the outside. And they begin to do all these crazy, crazy things. Serve the poor, heal the sick, care for their neighbors, give up their money, do all these things. Only and only because the gospel is being preached. Not rules. There's no book at this point saying you have to do this, you have to do that. None of that's here. Grace in the gospel is getting preached, and it's making a fundamental difference in people's lives. But you could summarize almost the entire book of Acts this way. It's Paul, it's Peter, it's Stephen at sometimes, preaching the gospel against idols. We haven't really talked about it in depth, the word idolatry, because it's such a heavy word. I know, it carries with it so much weight, idolatry. But throughout the book of Acts, that's really what they're doing. If we've seen this, they're pretty much saying, here's the gospel on the one hand, and you could choose to worship God, but if you don't, there's going to be something else inevitably that you do end up worshiping. Even when they're preaching to the Jewish audience, they're saying, listen, you've been following the Mosaic law, all the rules. When they're preaching to the Gentiles, they're saying, look, you've been bowing down to these altars. Here's a new God, and it comes through the message of the gospel. So, and again, I don't use the word idolatry because immediately it's real easy, I know, for us to sit there and go, we don't practice idolatry. And I'll give you a chance here, honestly. I'm going to give you an honest chance. We're a small group today. I'll give you a chance to end the sermon in 5 minutes. You can end it in 5 minutes, or you can end it, my limit's 25 anyway, so you're not going to be extending it too much longer. Don't raise your hand, or you kind of raise your hand a little bit. If you have anything at home right now, in your apartment, that's made, something, made of silver, made of wood, I don't care what it is. If you have anything in your home right now, again, you can end this in 5 minutes, we can go home, that you bow down and worship to. Like on a morning, you get up and you pray to it, you bow down and you worship that thing. If you have something like that, nobody's raising their hand. Okay, so then therefore, none of us have a problem with idolatry. Okay, is that safe to say? Now we can end it. That was 4.5 minutes, we could be done. No, obviously not. I'm not letting you go that easy. Listen, idolatry, this morning we have to expand our definition of this. And Paul does this. We see it in Ephesians. What's fascinating about this passage is that the gospel, there's actually no sermon. Every week there's been a sermon. Paul's given a sermon, Peter's given a sermon, Stephen's given a sermon, and there's no sermon here. But there's an invaluable lesson for us today to learn what this word idolatry means and to learn something about idols. And let me give some context here. I know we've been pacing along in the book here, so it's easy to get knocked out of the reference of time. This is probably about 20 to 25 years after Paul has started his missionary work. He's been doing this for a while. He's been doing it for 20, 25 years, maybe 30. He's been going from city to city in Asia Minor, all the big cities. In last week, we saw him going to Athens. He's been going into the marketplace. He's been going into the center of every city. He's been standing up and he's been preaching this gospel message, saying, listen, there's good news for you. If you're going to take your heart and set it on that good news, you will worship a God that it will forever change you. But it's quite clear throughout all of Paul's sermons, throughout all of Paul's activities, he's clear about it. And Luke, who's writing this book, is extremely clear that if you and I don't set our heart on the gospel every day, inevitably some idol will creep in. And we learned some things about idols today. There's 3 of them. I'm going to spend the most of the time this morning on the first one because I think it's the most important. And we learned that idols are subtle, they're powerful, but ultimately they're destructible. Now, subtle, powerful, and destructible. I'm going to spend time on the subtle part. Because like I said, I don't think any of you guys here today have something you go home and bow down to. I really hope you don't. I hope you don't have a statue like they did of Artemis. I hope you don't have that. So let's unearth our idols, because they're there. You see this in verse 25. Look at this really closely. It's easy to miss this. In verse 25, what gets them so mad? These people get enraged. They get furious. They drag Paul's friends down the street. They're shouting, and we'll get to that in a little bit, for 2 straight hours. What makes them so mad? If you study it, the very first thing that you see, Demetrius, this character Demetrius, he's a silversmith, right? He is. They make silver statues to the goddess Artemis, and Artemis was the goddess of Ephesus, the hometown. You could worship any other god, but you had to worship Artemis. And every year you had to buy a new statue. So you can imagine your home's filled with all these little Artemis statues. And every year you were compelled to buy a new one, which meant that the silversmiths and the metalworkers made quite a profitable business. And Ephesus was also in the middle of a trade route. So anybody who came through and wanted to pay homage to Artemis, the goddess of fertility, if you wanted to have a baby, you had to buy a statue. This was a money-making operation. It's hard to see that at first, but this is what's really going on. The silversmiths and the metalworkers get together and they say, wait a second. Paul is making these people convert. And when they convert and start believing and worshiping Jesus as their God, they no longer buy our statues. Do you see how simplistic this is? They weren't necessarily upset that Paul was threatening Artemis, which he wasn't. Paul wasn't saying don't go to the temple. Paul wasn't going into the temple and destroying things. He wasn't going into people's houses and destroying their statues. Paul was simply saying this: if you worship the God of heaven, you no longer need to buy these statues. And because they weren't buying the statues, there was an economic impact. See, Demetrius, where was his idol? Where were the idols of these silversmiths? It was in their wallet. Fundamentally speaking, and I know it sounds really simplistic, but that's what it was. And when Marilyn read from Matthew today, you see this, that we can't serve 2 masters, God or money. But it goes even deeper, and I'm going to push this. I'm going to push it a little bit. Because it'd be easy to say, well, they're just losing money. They're losing a lot of money. Thousands of people are being converted. They're losing tons of money. The gospel message to them was a threat to their comfort, their security, their livelihood, their lifestyles. Think about the economic impact. You start losing money on making statues and you're Demetrius. That's less money that you can take home to feed your family. That's less money than you have to make a 5-year plan. You don't have money to invest anymore. You see where I'm going with this? Ultimately, I'm reading into this, but ultimately what I feel is that these people, Demetrius and the silversmiths, their idol wasn't just the money, but what the money represented. Their idol had become the comfort of their lives. And see how subtle this is? See how we could read over this passage and it'd be easy to say, oh, they worship statues. No, they worshiped what was behind the statues of Artemis. They worshiped what those statues could give them in terms of success, in terms of comfort, in terms of lifestyle. Demetrius, if you were talking to him today, if he's here, I'm sure he would have said, if I can just get people to buy these things, then I'll be happy, I'll be okay. See, in our lives, this is why idols are so subtle, because they come in the form of saying, if I could just get this, then everything else will be okay. If I can just get this relationship, everything will be fine. If I can just get some success in this particular aspect of my life, I'll be fine. I can find rest. And I try to think of an illustration. I'm going to give you, first of all, I'm going to give you an illustration of myself in a second. And I'm going to psychoanalyze myself for about 5 minutes this morning. And I'm going to put myself out there for you to do that. But let me give you one other illustration, and it comes from somebody who's much better at illustrating this than I will be. Herman Melville wrote a book, obviously, that you must all know, called Moby Dick. Okay, now, why is this book considered a classic? If you think about it, it's a bunch of guys on a boat, one boat, the entire book, for like 500 pages, just guys on a boat chasing a whale. And yet, this book has resonated with people throughout the centuries because Herman Melville does the best job with capturing the human heart and the condition. And he does one of the best jobs in capturing what idolatry looks like when it's played out. And it comes in the central character, Captain Ahab, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But you remember what the premise of the story is, of course. You got Ahab, his leg was taken off by Moby Dick, the great white whale. The entire book, 500 pages or so, is him chasing after this whale. He's chasing after this white whale. Nothing will make him happy until he gets that white whale. And of course, Herman Melville is using this white whale as an example of what idols do to our lives. When we put our focus on something, on our white whale, we idolize it. We have to have it. And there's an interchange, and I put it in your outline. When Captain Ahab's going back and forth, his crew doesn't understand, why do you have to get this white whale? Why? But he knows that if he doesn't, he's going to be miserable. He's going to feel like a failure. He needs revenge, and he's going back and forth with the character Starbuck. And I know you know what you're thinking, coffee. No, not Starbucks, Starbuck, and it's a weird name. But he's going back and forth with Starbuck, who's one of his shipmates. And then I put the dialogue a little bit in there. Starbuck looks at him and says, "Vengeance on a dumb brute that simply smote thee from blindest instinct." He says, "Look, the whale didn't know what he was doing." He says, "This is dumb vengeance, Ahab. Why are you doing this?" And he says, "This is madness, to be enraged by a dumb thing." He says, "Ahab, look, why do you have to get this white whale? It's going to drive you crazy." And Ahab gives one of the best examples of what idols do to you and me. He looks at Starbuck and he says this. He actually has a long dialogue, but in the middle of it he says, "How can a prisoner reach outside except through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall, shoved near to me. He tasks me, he heaps me. I see him in outrageous strength. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. I will wreak that hate upon him." Ahab says, "Look, the white whale is like a wall that pushes against me as a prisoner. He's a prisoner to chasing this white whale." And ultimately, at the end of the story, as you know, the Pequod, I always mess up that pronunciation of that boat. It sinks, Ahab dies because he's pursuing this white whale. It's his demise. His obsession with having to have this one thing, if I can just get this, then I will be okay. And his crew says, "Do you know how stupid that is? Do you know what you're going to do to yourself?" And he says, "It's like a prisoner pushing the wall close to me. I have to break out of this. I need that white whale." And in the end, obviously, it ends with him dying. And Ishmael, who's narrating the story, has got a great line towards the end of the book when he's thinking about Ahab and his pursuit of this white whale. And I'm going to make sense of the white whale in a second. Bear with me. But he says this. Ishmael says, "Where lies the final harbor, whence we unmoor no more?" What he means, unmoor is a fancy English word just to say you pull up your anchors on a boat. Ishmael says, where's that final harbor where we get rest? Herman Melville basically sketches out in the book hopelessness when you pursue idols, when you have to get the white whale, because Ishmael says, where's the final harbor? Where's our rest? You have an image of a boat constantly pulling up anchor and going out to sea and coming back and casting anchors, pulling back the anchors and going back out to the sea. Ishmael sees the futility of this. Listen, this is what you and I have to deal with in unearthing our idols because they are so subtle. You all have a white whale. We all do. And I'm going to tell you my white whale. Okay, I'm going to give you a stupid illustration of my white whale and then hopefully psychoanalyze myself a little more. And the reason why I'm doing it is that so you can psychoanalyze yourself a little bit this morning to find your white whale, because I know you have it. We all do. Here's my white whale. We're a small group, obviously, right now. Before the summertime, we were, 30, 35 people, getting more and more people. But summertime churches, people are on vacation and so on and so forth. Last summer, I found out my white whale. Because we were growing, and then the summertime came and we lost some people, and I thought, surely, come September, when everybody's back, we're going to grow. We're just going to grow and grow. I actually thought, do we have enough spaces? How silly is this, right? Now, this is a dumb illustration. And of course, we didn't grow. We actually shrank. We went from probably 30 people to 20. There were times when it was like 5 or we probably had more people on the praise team than we did in the pews at any given Sunday. Now, this is a dumb illustration. I'm going to get deeper in a second. It got to the point that I was almost ashamed of myself. I felt like I was doing something wrong. Because surely I thought if I'm a good preacher, they will come in mass. Once the word gets out, it's bound to flow in, all the people wanting to hear my great words of eloquence, which that isn't even eloquence. So there's my proof. I'm not a good preacher. I thought, surely if I'm a good enough preacher, if I'm a good enough leader, this room's going to fill up, and it didn't. Week after week after week. And I remember a time around October of last year that I always sit here in the front, of course, and I had the inability to even turn around. Because I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see how few people were here. And now that I'm being serious here, and it gripped me. Now, what's my white whale? My white whale, obviously, was the need to see that my preaching, my leadership was being rewarded by a growing congregation. The number of people out here was determining how I felt in here. Now that's the dumb illustration. Let me psychoanalyze myself a little bit, and then I'll move on. Because I'm going to show you where my white whale came from. I had to have this room full. And if I didn't have this room full, then I wasn't happy. To the point that even singing the songs, I wasn't even thinking about it. I was thinking, oh my gosh, when I turn around, how many people are going to be there? How sickening is that? Now I thought a lot about it, and I've prayed a lot about this over the winter time, and I started to think, and in praying about it, I remembered an expression my dad always said, and my dad always had these corny expressions. He's probably going to watch this on video, so I have to be nice to him, but very corny. And one of them he always said when I was growing up was, everybody in life wants a pat on the back. Everybody wants a pat on the back. Now it depends culturally where you're from. Maybe you're thinking hug or a pat on the shoulder or a handshake. And I always thought that he meant you should be nice to people. That's what I thought that's what he meant, and that's not what he meant. And in talking to him, he's also a pastor of a small church in America, and in talking to him about this particular community and sharing with him, he reminded me of that phrase, but he said, you had it all wrong. He said, no, everybody wants a pat on the back because it tells you that you're special. We all in our lives want a pat on our back. For somebody to say, listen, you are good. You are really good. Now my pat on the back would come if this room was filled up. Not anymore. I want to tell you how I broke through with that. My white whale did go out to sea on that one. I'm not chasing that one anymore. I got other ones that I'm working on. But I'm going to tell you one that was in the past, not one right now. That white whale eluded me because that white whale said, fill up this room or you're a failure. Get the people here or you're just not that good. Now, idols are not just subtle. That was very subtle. It took me a while to figure out what that white whale was, what my idol was. I wanted the pat on the back. I wanted the affirmation. And by the way, after service, give me a pat on the back. That'd be nice. You could say, attaboy, good job, great sermon, or something like that. I don't care. Anyway, I don't need the pat on the back so much. I don't need that anymore. But for so long, it gripped me. Because idols are just that subtle. It's Captain Ahab going after the whale and saying, it's a wall that pushes against me, and I have to push it back. Otherwise, nothing. And in the end, he becomes nothing. Idols are not only subtle, they're extremely powerful. Do you see this in verse 34? Again, it's easy to miss this. In verse 34, the people are so enraged when their comfort is threatened. They're so pissed off when their money is threatened, when their security. They grab these people, drag them down the street, and Alexander, he gets up to say something to calm them down, and they begin to shout, and it says they shouted for 2 straight hours in one voice. The mob, 2 straight hours. They shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Let that sink in. Is there anything in your life that you'd be willing to shout about for 2 straight hours? That's a long time to shout for something. Let's put it in perspective. Most of you know that I love football, soccer and American football. And of course, I'm a huge Dallas Cowboys fan. I'm going to say that out loud. Fine. That's the only time in my life I show emotion, is when they're playing a football game. You know this. I'm not an emotional guy. I don't really weep or cry. I don't really get too high or too low. I'm pretty even keel. But when that game is on, I will stand up and shout, most of the time at them because they're doing something stupid. I will stand up in exultation if they score. I will be happy. A football game goes for about 3 hours. Now, I could not sustain that for that long a time. I've got to sit down. I've got to take a break. I'll lose my voice. I'll look like an idiot if I scream for 2 straight hours. Yet, these people, when their idols are threatened, shout and shout for 2 hours. See, the threat to their idol, the threat to their white whale, the threat to their comfort and security, their lifestyle, their money, was so deeply powerful that it caused them to have a disproportionate reaction. Again, Paul wasn't going into their homes and destroying things, and yet they are so enraged. And I'm not going to spend too long on this one. I want to move on. Idols are subtle. You have to unearth them, but they're extremely powerful, because when they get threatened, when your white whale gets threatened, or when your idol gets threatened, you will be enraged, shouting for hours, railing against it, gnashing teeth. That's what Ahab did. That's what these people did. But they're not only subtle and powerful, idols ultimately are destructible. How do we do it? Let's game plan here. I'm going to give you the theology, and then I'm going to give you the practical application. First, the theology. Do you notice what happens here first? How did this whole thing start? In Acts, I had Joe read verses 1 through 10 on purpose, and then he skipped down. In verses 1 through 10, Paul shows up in Ephesus, and he starts preaching the gospel, and he starts talking about the kingdom of God. But when he shows up, there's people who said, yeah, I'm a Christian. I believe what John said. I've heard about Jesus. Here's the difference. See, they knew Jesus in their head. They didn't yet know him in their heart. And Paul says, look, if you want to know Jesus, here, I'm going to preach him. And when he preaches Jesus, amazing things start to happen. When Paul preaches Jesus, when he preaches the kingdom of God, they start to turn from their idols. And there's a section I didn't read when they says that they brought all their books, their old books of sorcery, which again would have gathered in money. They would have earned money off of these books, and they burned them. Don't burn books. That's not what I'm saying here today. Don't ever burn books if you can. But here's what they're saying. They're saying, listen, when the gospel's preached to me, when I hear this good news about Jesus, I'm going to give up the things that I previously thought were the most important in my life. All the things that I was pursuing, my idols, my white whales, all of it's going in the fire. Simply stated in verse 26, Demetrius says, this guy Paul is preaching that gods made with hands are not gods. And this is logical. If you and I follow a white whale, if we worship our idols, those are man-made things. They ultimately will fail us. They're not gods, right? What he's saying is, by very nature of a statue, that can't be a god. It can't do anything for you in times of suffering. It can't answer any of your questions. Paul says, look, these gods that you've been worshiping, they're made by hands, and therefore they're no god at all. They're going to do no good for you when you need them the most. In verse 8, Paul preaches the kingdom of God. Ishmael says, wherein lies that final harbor, from whence we can unmoor no more? Here, hopefully you started to think a little bit about your white whale. or your idols this morning, if you want to destroy them, if we want to destroy them as a community, in community with one another, if we want to start working on these together, we have to turn our eyes to what Luke chapter 23, Luke, who wrote that book, Gospel of Luke, who also wrote the book of Acts, talks about Jesus on the cross saying, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And Luke writes, depending on your translation, he breathed his last. That word literally means expired. It means Jesus expired. And what he says by that is, look, I'm on a cross for you. I'm taking this suffering for you. You have a choice. Worship the God who died on a wooden cross, or worship these little silver statues. Which one's going to do something for you in the moments of crisis in your life? What's going to make you happy ultimately? Where is that final harbor where you can rest? And in Jesus, he says, hey, listen, your idols are going to wear you out. If you need the affirmation of people, if you need their respect, if you need success, if you need relationships, if you need that friendship, if you need it more than you need me, Jesus says, it will wear you down. You will become like that mob, confused, shouting, enraged. But if we look to the one who expired for us, that's how we start to destroy our idols. Take it back to me and my white whale. There was a quote from a pastor that I greatly admire, one of my theological mentors, and you guys probably know him, Tim Keller from Redeemer in New York City. And he has a great quote where he said, and it's probably been butchered a lot now, but he says something to the effect of this: Jesus cared more about the quality in the response to his message than the quantity in the response to his message. He says basically this: Jesus cared more, not about the number of people that were responding to him, but about the depth in which they were responding to him. And it took that quote for me to start thinking about my white whale and saying, you're right. I don't care about the quantity. I care about the quality. See, the gospel tells me I've already got my pat on the back. I've already got it. I would love it for you, like I said, if you could afterwards, give me the pat on the back. But I've already got the greatest pat in the back in the world that I would ever need. And it comes from God. And I'm reminded of that when I look to the cross. And I see Jesus saying, Father, I'm giving up my spirit for them. I'm giving up all the pats on the back that I deserve so that they can be patted on the back. If you and I begin to rest in that, and it's an everyday thing, that will become what we worship. Hence the name of the sermon. Instead of the white whales that lead to our destruction. Ishmael says, where's the final harbor from whence we unmoor no more? I'm telling you today, that final harbor is in the cross. It's in the resurrection. That's where we find rest. Please pray with me. Father,